Ever the curious explorer, William S. Burroughs felt a desire to push the envelope of self-destruction, drug use, and, yes, writing. From his first taste of morphine in 1944, most of his life would be spent dealing with on and off addictions. Still, he wrote. Mostly letters, sometimes stories. He jotted them down when inspiration hit and stored them away for a later time. These writings eventually led to his third novel, Naked Lunch. Though a much harder read than his previous two novels, which told a story with a narrative and was chronologically structured, Naked Lunch would ironically become his most famous book. You see, he started with an almost regular narrative as with his previous novels, but after years of spiraling into drugs, madness, self-abuse, and introspection, he arrived at what would be known as the anti-narrative and thus created an anti-novel. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, structures, and madness. I am your host, Jason Moore Harden, inviting you to join us as we take another peek into the chaotic and non-linear world of William S. Burroughs and his novel, Naked Lunch. Though we covered Mr. Burroughs' novel Junkie on episode 29, additional information encourages us to revisit it, if only as a way to understand how he developed as a writer and how he came to write Naked Lunch. When he recounted the history of his pre-1945 years in the preface to Junkie in 1953, he wrote that his self-characterization was marked by a lack of and a quest for motive, direction, and need. In his teens, he had drifted into solo adventures of juvenile risk-taking before making his way to Harvard, where he majored in English literature for lack of interest in any other subject. Now, after Harvard, he drifted around Europe for a year or so. Then, still unable to find a path that allured him, took graduate courses in psychology and jiu-jitsu, all while flirting on the edges of criminal behavior. Now, concerning his addiction, he said, "You become a narcotics addict because you do not have strong motivations in any other direction. I drifted along taking shots when I could score. I ended up hooked. You don't decide to be an addict." It is not until 1950 that Burroughs, on a copy of Jack Kerouac's debut novel, On the Road, writes that he's begun a novel of his own, titled Junk at the Time. Burroughs has big doubts about the salability of his book. Nevertheless, he keeps working on it. After working on the manuscript for roughly a year, he makes the very reasonable remark. "I don't mean it as a justification or a deterrent or anything, but an accurate account of what I experienced during the time I was on junk. For one thing, the book was written in Mexico. It is difficult for anyone living in the States to realize how meaningless such a concept as justification is down here." Unconcerned with either defensive or aggressive impulses, he intended neither to justify nor to deter, but rather to document. In later revisions of drafts, he cut out all the theory and domestic relations in order to stick to a straight narrative, to get the message across as clearly as possible without the glam of artistry. Ultimately, he was quite pleased that publishers didn't want to edit or meddle with his writing in Junkie. A huge contrast to what would come several years down the line with Naked Lunch. Looking back in 1965, Burroughs recalled that when he began writing Junkie, quote, "There didn't seem to be any strong motivation. I didn't feel compelled. I had nothing else to do." What divides Junkie from his second novel, Queer, and what steered the novel documenting his addiction to lead to a novel whose writing itself resembled an addiction could be attributed to the killing of his wife. That's right, his wife. In the introduction to Queer on its publication in 1985, he confirmed that, quote, "The book is motivated and formed by an event which is never mentioned and, in fact, is carefully avoided, the accidental shooting death of my wife, Joan, in September 1951. And this shooting, accidental, was a turning point. And before the incident, an autobiography about Burroughs would read like a typical office document. In essence, a carefully detailed recount of real events. whereas after the incident, his life reads more like a novel, albeit a novel few would wish to write, and none perhaps, except Burroughs, could live and survive. It is from this point on that we begin to see in his letters, as in his writing, a new interdependence between his persona and his writing. He arrived in Tangier at New Year 1954, which by then was an international zone and Freeport, technically not a part of Morocco at all. While the rest of the country was divided between France and Spain, Tangier was uniquely colonized by 8 jealous yet indifferent foreign powers. The result was a hybrid, neither African nor Western, but rather a city with many identities and therefore none. It was both a collage where anything goes and a place that was a kind of no man's land that attracted a similarly displaced personnel. Junkies, queers, drunks, about like Mexico, noting his experience of the place. Well, like all places where outlaw morality runs amok, there is also an abundance of temptations. After only 4 months in Tangier, he found himself heavily addicted to heroin once again. He did continue to write, however, writings that would later become Naked Lunch. Now, in 1954, April, after numerous attempts to get feedback from his friend Allen Ginsberg, Burroughs pleads to Jack Kerouac, writing, "The withdrawal symptoms are worse than the marker habit. One letter would fix me, so make it your business, if you are a real friend, to see that he writes me a fix. I am incapacitated, can't write, can't take interest in anything." You see, Burroughs feels a desperate need to receive a letter from Ginsberg in order to keep going. The letters he has been sending Ginsberg have gradually grown to constitute a unique epistolic eroticism, an economy in which love serves as a literal pretext. For example, in that letter he wrote to Kerouac, "Whenever I encounter the impasse of unrequited affection, my only recourse is in routines." Now, as dependent on Ginsberg, who was an ocean away as he was on Junk, Burroughs lets his routines become the harvest of a grim reaping of his own erotic and emotional failure. He stayed on in Tangier until September 1954, his addiction eating up his parents' $200 monthly check and leaving him on the edge of poverty and illness by the end of his 9-month-long journey. Now, I am just writing to put off the misery I will feel when I stop writing, he comments the following month. I know it's there, waiting for me. Following his stay in Tangier, and upon reaching England, he began an apomorphine treatment in 1956. By then, he knew that the death and life of addiction had to end in writing. This time, I'll make it if it kills me. Quote, "There is only one thing a writer can write about, what is in front of his senses at the moment of writing. I am a recording instrument. I do not presume to impose story, plot, continuity, insofar as I succeed in direct recording of certain areas of psychic process. I may have limited function. I am not an entertainer." End quote. The technique he would apply to Naked Lunch consisted of typing up a page, then cutting out sections, individual sentences, and even words with a razor, and rearranging the jumbled pieces into a new order. Going all in on this technique, he found his way back to his previous stories and brought them back employing this same method, the cut-up technique. What came about was something dreamlike, difficult to understand, and wholly fascinating. To William Burroughs, the cut-up technique introduced an element of randomness that changed everything. Instead of writing being like a still life or like a simple rendition of events, writing with the use of cut-ups was like discovering a radiance of life and writing once again. It explored a sensory process that was going on all the time, and Burroughs saw it as being able to extend the limits of literature. It was like when you're reading a newspaper, but you aren't able to remain on one column. Instead, you jump from column to column, taking in bits and pieces of each story. Then imagine that you also start reading from the column of the paper sitting next to you. The story you compile in your mind with this exercise is one wholly different and might not even make sense, but it does create something original and new. Now, the cut-up technique also bore the power to juxtapose what was going on and what you were doing at the time and what was happening around you. In a sense, it seemed to be able to bend reality. Now, before Burroughs, French painter and sculptor Marcel Duchamp employed the cut-up technique years before by placing 4 unconnected writings in 4 divisions of a square. And before Duchamp, mathematician and physicist John von Neumann introduced the cut-up principle of random action in his theory of games and economic behavior. Now, following his stint in Tangier, Burroughs devoted himself entirely to cut-ups, putting in 8-hour days of manic creation. A fellow Beat Generation writer, Brian Geeson, gave him a couple of correspondence baskets and file cabinets, and Burroughs would spend his days cutting strips from his favorite writers and his own writing, then randomly rearranging the strips while looking away and typing up the result. He even cut up his letters to friends, so that a December letter to fellow writer Paul Bowles went like this: "Smashed and tumbled, the thirsty off once more. Sums of dwellings and darkness across the somewhere in that masonry of shattered fragments, castle host set. Goodbye to their desert, the riot-blown tombs, disemboweled houses marking the site. Black hinterland garden with a meaning of dust." This text, Burroughs would explain, was a cut-up arrangement of a passage by British novelist and poet Lawrence Durrell. Paul Bowles didn't see the cut-up method as a language for narration, but more a language to alienate the reader, which didn't make sense. You could read it, you could force yourself to go from word to word, but you came out at the other end no happier and no wiser. It was clear to Bowles that Burroughs was under the influence of Brian Geeson, who, having allied himself with Burroughs, had a stake in his reputation. You see, Geeson had a strong vested interest in the cut-ups, stating that writing was 50 years behind painting, which to Paul made no sense at all. It was like saying that an orange had a better form than an apple. You looked at a painting in the same way that you looked at any object, but writing still had to be read on a printed page, left to right, line by line, word by word, and if the words had no meaning, the reader was lost. Why not use the Cyrillic alphabet? That would be the ultimate cut-up. Well, anyway, for Burroughs, the cut-up was the great breakthrough he had been searching for. So what if people couldn't read it? They would get used to it. After all, any advance in the arts is always at first misunderstood. Furthermore, he understood the value of creating anti-writing. In 1955, Burroughs had noted that his novels, Junk, Queer, and the Yage Letters, written in collaboration with Allen Ginsberg, reconstructed his past. Naked Lunch, on the other hand, with its abrupt transitions and contradictions, tended to accomplish the opposite. In September 1957, he felt feedback from Ginsberg was disappointing, as Ginsberg argued for a linear continuity, considering any attempt at chronological arrangement extremely ill-advised. While this certainly clarified matters for Burroughs, he still rejected the advice bluntly. What he was attempting to write went completely against tradition, and that was the intent. He wasn't interested in the structure or confines of traditional fiction regarding how it presented time, stories, or identities. He was interested in a form that reproduced his very personal experiences of both Tangier and his drug-induced sensitivity to the strange unfolding of histories, cultures, and encounters in the place. And this would result in a style that could blend dream and reality seamlessly, a fusion of past and future, fact and fantasy. Now, after 3 months of frantic writing and self-analysis through the winter of 1957 in Tangier, he felt ready for the next step. The new style had come with a new identity, which demanded a new locale and a break with the past. Ready to be sent to publishers, he deemed Paris, France as the only place where a book such as his could be published, and Maurice Girodias of Olympia Press was appointed as perhaps the only person to consider doing it. Unfortunately, Girodias had already rejected the manuscript. However, an excerpt that appeared in magazines in the U.S. would change this. The Black Mountain Review and the Chicago Review, thanks to Allen Ginsberg, ran sections of the book. Irving Rosenthal, a graduate student recently made editor of the Chicago Review, was excited by the Beat Generation writers and the San Francisco poets and typically ran their work. Now, according to Burroughs, Rosenthal said he would publish everything he would send. Burroughs, of course, was overjoyed. This was all the encouragement he needed to begin his deluge of material to Rosenthal. Rosenthal then wrote to Allen Ginsberg saying of Burroughs, "He is the most uneven best writer I ever read. It's unbelievable." To Burroughs, Rosenthal was the only editor who really understood what he was doing. When the autumn 1958 issue of the Chicago Review appeared that October, it included writings that contained the words shit, ass, and fuck, which caused quite a backlash. Now, soon after, an October 25th column entitled Filthy Writing on the Midway by Chicago Daily News columnist Jack Mabley called the Chicago Review issue one of the foulest collections of printed filth he'd ever seen publicly circulated. Now, according to Mabley, the obscene words were like, quote, kids chalking a four-letter verb on the Oak Street underpass, and wrote that the university, quote, should take a long, hard look at what is being circulated under its sponsorship. Now, student editors of the review were supposed to have editorial autonomy. However, Mabley's outrage put university authorities on the defensive. Even old grads were calling in to complain. Furthermore, the fundraisers and public relations people said the review's excesses were undermining their efforts. Well, Rosenthal and 6 members of the Chicago Review staff resigned in protest. Soon thereafter, Rosenthal and poetry editor Paul Carroll started their own magazine, running the suppressed material in the first issue in March 1959. Now, Jack Kerouac got word that they were looking for a title, so he sent a telegram suggesting Big Table, which was derived from a note he had left himself on his writing desk. Get a bigger table. A Big Table it became, with the first issue incorporating 10 episodes from Naked Lunch, Kerouac's Old Angel Midnight, and 3 poems by Gregory Corso. The issue's subtitle was The Complete Contents of the Suppressed Winter 1959 Chicago Review. Now, the Postmaster General at the time, Arthur Summerfield, was known to be a hardliner on pornography. Well, that March, several hundred copies of Big Table were held up by the Chicago Post Office. This, however, did not deter Rosenthal and Carroll, who had the entire printing of 10,000 copies shipped to New York and San Francisco. In fact, the post office impounding spawned national notability for the magazine, leading to the issue being sold out. Then, after a judicial ruling stating that the magazine was not to be stopped from being mailed, Big Table continued to publish 5 issues in all of which were mailed. Now, Burroughs' delight turned sour, however, when he heard the magazine had been declared obscene by the U.S. Post Office. This, he knew, would make publication of Naked Lunch in the United States impossible. However, as a result of the controversy, Naked Lunch came into the public eye and found its way to the eyes of Maurice Girodias, who, as we mentioned, had rejected it the previous year. Now, Maurice Girodias' specialty was publishing suppressed books, so he got in touch with Burroughs, inviting him to dinner. He found Burroughs impossible to grasp, however, being a completely unprecedented type, a man who looked so intensely respectable and puritanical, a man who wrote such obscene prose. He was difficult to talk to because he was so silent and ghostly. He looked frail, terminal. Nevertheless, Burroughs' talent was undeniable, and Girodias wrote him on June 6th, asking him to be allowed to get another look at Naked Lunch. From that point on, things happened very fast. Now, Giro Diaz decided to publish the book, drawing up a contract giving Burroughs an $800 advance and giving himself 1/3 of the English language rights. Now, Ginsberg wrote from New York warning Burroughs to, quote, make sure he doesn't own half of you, as if you were a prize fighter. Well, Giro Diaz invited Burroughs to his restaurant and says to him, this is a complicated business full of angles. I know them. You don't. Let me handle it. You'll have to trust me. Now, Burroughs knew that under his timid and confused manner, Maurice Giro Diaz was a very smart man, and that he also might get lucky with the book. You see, Burroughs had been witness to the struggles Kerouac had to go through for 5 years trying to get On the Road published, and therefore figured this was the best deal around. Now, in a decision Burroughs would come to regret, he agreed to let Giro Diaz avoid U.S. taxes by transferring the book royalties to Switzerland, where they would be funneled through his agent, Odetta Hummel. In July 1959, Sinclair Bales, acting as Giro Diaz's go-between, told Burroughs that he had exactly 10 days to prepare the manuscript for the printer. And the deadline pressure helped to weld the book into one organic whole, with Bales and Brian Geeson helping with the editing as section after section was carried by Bales from the Beat Hotel to the Olympia offices a few blocks away. And the sections of the novel were sent to the printer in random order, but when the galleys came back, this random order seemed to mostly work, and they were kept that way, except for a few changes. Burroughs corrected the proofs and designed the jacket, and so by the end of July, the book was rolling off the presses for a run of 10,000 copies, twice the usual Olympia printing. And quite rapidly, there was a small flurry of acquisition. Limes Verlag offered $400 for the German rights. Mondadori took it for Italy. Burroughs was told, however, that they were buying it to keep it off the market. And Barney Rosset of Grove Press bought the American rights for $3,000. In France, Gallimard bought it in a translation by Giro Diaz's brother, Eric Kahane. However, through them, the book appeared with a barre noire, a black stripe, meaning that under prevailing laws, it could not be placed in bookstore windows. It took 3 long years for the book to hit stores in the U.S., but when it was published on November 20th, 1962, its reputation and controversy made it a solid splash, nearly selling 8,000 copies in less than a month, and more than 14,000 copies in the first 4 months. William S. Burroughs was a voice to be reckoned with, an extreme one at that. In January 1963, Grove Press was met with trouble when detectives in Boston arrested bookstore owner Theodore Mavrikos for selling an obscene book. And this book was naturally Naked Lunch. After the Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller controversy, which you can hear more about on episode 52, Grove Press publisher Barney Rosset did not intend to pay the legal costs of booksellers arrested for selling Naked Lunch. Not one to easily give in without a fight, however, he asked lawyer Edward de Grazia to defend it. And de Grazia, who read Naked Lunch, considered it to be an important book, which led him to convince the Massachusetts Attorney General to put the book itself on trial for obscenity. In short, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled on July 7, 1966, that Naked Lunch was not without redeeming social value and was thus not obscene. And while the book was finally being published, Burroughs had a more immediate problem. The arrangement that the American royalties would be sent to Giro Diaz's agent in Switzerland was not working out, as no money was getting to Burroughs. In Tangier at the time, he was so broke he could not pay his rent or repair his typewriter. And to make matters worse, he had told his parents he no longer needed the $200 a month allowance from them now that he had his book royalties. Thus, for the first time in his life, he was both financially independent and broke. So in February 1964, he confronted Giro Diaz and was told that the money was wasted on women. Now, feeling guilty about his treatment of Burroughs, Giro Diaz wrote Grove Press's Barney Rosset explaining the situation. In turn, Grove Press began sending Burroughs his 2/3 of the American royalties directly. So by 1967, he had received a total of $39,008.52. for Naked Lunch. Well, some critics thought the experimentation went too far. They felt Naked Lunch was too fragmented, too episodic, too obscene, and too alien. And the irony is that Burroughs never imagined he was writing an experimental novel. He was simply writing what felt right to him, as simple and as complicated as that was. And while he admitted to using shock to impact the reader with some outrageous scenes, nothing in the book, he'd like to point out, was as absurd as what one read in the daily newspaper. He was quite open about his intention, which was not to entertain, but instruct. And when the Titanic is sinking, which he felt the literary world was facing a similar fate, the only sensible thing to do is point the way to the lifeboats. For this reason, and despite being difficult, maybe even near impossible to understand, Naked Lunch continues to be read more than half a century after its publication and has never been out of print. As usual, let's wrap up the episode with a quote. The first and most important thing an individual can do is to become an individual again, decontrol himself, train himself as to what is going on, and win back as much independent ground for himself as possible. End quote. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/houseofwords or paypal.me/houseofwordspodcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who may find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps. More than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages.
House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez. Narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Harden. And music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.